Welcome to Swiss Holistic Institute, inviting you to this video podcast series on spiritual elderhood with Bob Weathers and Thomas Rüedi. Today's issue is Indigenous science compared with Western science.
Welcome back, everybody, to a podcast conversation between two friends. I'm Bob Weathers, and this is my dear friend, Dr. Thomas Rüedi. Welcome to you, Thomas.
Hello.
We're going to be discussing today in a series that hopefully you've been viewing on spiritual elderhood. We're going to be discussing a book that Dr. Rüedi, I'm going to call you Thomas, studied in preparing for a book that he's since published since our last meeting together, our last podcast. I highly recommend it to you, especially if you're fluent in German. It's a beautiful book, Elderhood, and it's really the topic of our not only of our podcast, but it's the groundwork. It's the foundation of information, and I'm sure that Thomas will be discussing this more. One of the projects that Thomas and I have in mind is to translate this into English, hopefully over the next year, to have it available for our English-speaking audience. Although my German is quite rusty, I've reviewed the entire book and it looks so incredibly rich. So I'm extremely motivated to get the book translated into English.
Right.
Tomas's English is very good, and then together what we might do is refine it. But this book is a gold mine, and I really want to compliment you and bow to you, Tomas, for what you've accomplished. This book is really, it's been sitting in my quiet time in the morning is in the kitchen, and I have a little table in there. It's been sitting right in the middle of that table all week long, and I open it every morning. I just love this book.
And as it is my pocket version, you have you can have it with you everywhere, you know.
I just slip it inside my jacket pocket. Tomas wrote me this week. He said, "I hope you're enjoying your tiny pocketbook." And I cracked up because it's a full format, really coffee table size book, is what we would say in English, and it's full of photography and just wisdom from beginning to end. Now, in that book, Tomas cites a book that we're going to be discussing more today. The title of the book that we're discussing is Indigenous Sustainable Wisdom. And Tomas, you may want to fill that in with more detail when we get there, but it's a really important edited volume. And today's focus is on the topic of indigenous science as compared with Western science. And this book covers so many things. It's written by contributors from academic circles, but it's very readable. And the discussion today I want to introduce around this topic of comparing two very different models of science. Now, the book argues for the value of both of them being incorporated, but the truth of the matter is that Tomas knows this from his background as a scientist, as a dentist, and I do as my background as a psychologist, that our training, I'll speak for my training in the US in psychology, was not embracing of indigenous wisdom. And were it not for a few cultural anthropology electives that I could take in graduate school, I would have been completely in the dark. And so this book, Indigenous Sustainable Wisdom, really reopens a dialogue that's very important. And it's right at the heart of Tomas's book on elderhood, is looking at a very different approach, because as it goes with Western science, so does it go towards Western approaches to aging. The idea that aging, you become less and less relevant, that you cannot contribute, and that's the very opposite of the native or the indigenous traditions. And so in that spirit, Tomas invited me to select a passage to introduce our conversation today. Tomas, I'll read this together. I'll give the page number out of the book. And then I want to invite our dialogue. It's just a really rich, the entire book. And this particular section of the book looks at the philosophical base of native science or indigenous science. And that's really what we're talking about today, is a very different way of looking at the world and how we study the world and so on. So I selected 5 sentences, Tomas. The 5 sentences are the substance of a paragraph. I could have picked almost anything because I've been
Yeah,
reading the book and
I
enjoying
know.
it. This is just meant to kind of pique our interest, and then, Tomas, you and I'll move into conversation. So, 5 sentences out of this book on the philosophical base of native science. This is in a chapter on plants, native science, and sustainability, written by Gregory Cayete, I think. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but I just want to reference him. And for anybody that's interested in this book, I'm reading from page 126. It's right in the middle of the book, right in the heart of the book. So here goes the 5 sentences. Development of knowledge through native science is guided by spirituality, ethical relationship, mutualism, reciprocity, respect, restraint, a focus on harmony, and acknowledgement of interdependence. So right away, you get the idea that we're looking at a very different approach to looking at science from the very individualistic approach in the West. Let me continue. This knowledge is integrated with regard to a particular place toward the goal of sustainability. So it's not disembodied. It's located in a place. It's no accident, Tomas. I so appreciate your opening. I read your opening introduction to this tree on your cover. This 800-year-old tree in Germany. It's really
Yeah.
a beautiful photograph, and the story that you tell about the tree. This is a way to locate ourselves in place, in space, in time. And this is what science doesn't do. It moves away from particularity and certainly has, because of that, has almost no concept of sustainability. So that's what this second sentence is talking
Mm.
about, place and sustainability. The third sentence, native science knowledge is derived using many of the same methods as modern Western science, including classifying, inferring, questioning, observation, interpreting, predicting, monitoring, problem solving, and adapting. And as I mentioned earlier, as you can see, native science doesn't throw out the very best of Western science. It just adds so much more. And so the goals of indigenous science in terms of its methodology overlap significantly, but there's also some really important differences, which is why we're discussing this. Let me go on. In fact, the
Mm.
next sentence, the fourth sentence, addresses difference. The difference is that native science perceives from a high context view. That's the term that it uses. I hadn't encountered that before. It's from a high context view. I think of a 30,000 foot view as the way that we talk about this in English, the way that you'd see it if you were in a plane up high in the sky. Native science perceives from a high context view, including all relational connections in its consideration. And there you get the essence of this, is that it's oriented towards the relationship between the various objects of inquiry, whereas Western science, which you're familiar with, Tomas, and I am too, wants to separate things out and look at things individually outside of context. And while there's value to that, there's a huge cost paid if you don't integrate relationship, or what he calls mutuality. Here's the final science. In contrast, Western science perceives from a low context view. We'll call it a 1-inch view. Reducing awareness of complex interconnections to a minimum, basically wiping them out. So those are the 5 sentences here looking at a basis for understanding native or indigenous science as compared with Western science. I'd love to invite your response in any way, Tomas, and I intend to engage with you as we talk, but I'm really interested in this topic. Yeah, yeah,
All right. Bob, thank you very much for this introduction.
yeah.
I like this style we have chosen for the last few sessions to have these introductions texts, and then to start with from the
Yes.
text into the exchange, because it gives a certain pointedness to certain issues,
Yes.
But on the other hand, what we normally do is then we really feel free how like intuitively we are responding to this. And um, yes, I think uh, for me an interesting point, if you say there are several indicators of scientific work, uh, on one hand in the indigenous scientific system and in the Western scientific system. I mean, only to talk about indigenous uh, science is just a quite a big step, because I think probably nobody of us have ever heard from this, because it seems too basic and too wild and too um, so it gives a nice point of eye level view.
Yes.
And
Yes.
what is very interesting to me is that you're saying there are quite a lot of characteristics how to work that are similar. And and
Yes.
in some texts I read, this is what they say, like from the indigenous side is the in the beginning science were quite close. When the first scientists came to these places where indigenous people live, they found out they are on a certain uh, part of the work, they're quite similar. And I think on the other hand that there is what most people didn't realize, all the scientists coming to these places when indigenous people live, is that the view is much broader than this. It's incredibly much broader, but also it's pointed to a certain common structure, you know, you have to see these structures at the same time, and you don't separate them. So,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
and I think one talking about Western science, especially uh, in this, we have been talking about Anthropocene, and um, it is it seems to be getting even more narrow,
Yeah.
and more and more narrow. So this is something that is really um, yeah, that hits my
Yeah.
eyes and my ears when I hear this text read by you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. A couple of thoughts came up for me as I listened to you, Tomas. If I go back to when I began graduate school, which was all those years ago, I had the good fortune my first year of taking a course that was co-taught by a psychologist and a cultural anthropologist. Up to that point, I had majored in psychology in college, so I'd had however many courses in psychology. And what I didn't realize is that they were all operating from a Western scientific limitation, which was their radical individualism and also their allegiance to empiricism, looking at things from the outside. And so I still remember fondly, Paul Hebert was the name of the anthropologist who had spent years in field work in the country of India, probably back in the 1950s and 60s. And he was my introduction to a different way of looking at things. And though he didn't use the term indigenous science, that's what he was teaching. And there were two things that stood out to me in that I'd never been exposed to and wasn't exposed to outside of a handful of courses. I took other courses from him and one other anthropologist at school, is that they acknowledge that the Western system is very good at, say, classifying plants with their Latin names. It's very good at that. And there's much respect. But the native traditions, they have much more refinement in looking at a number of things. The relationships of plants to their environment, which is not typically what the way that I'll stick with psychology since I'm not a botanist, is that psychology, the psychology that I studied before and after graduate school was primarily individualistic, looking at an individual. You know, Tomas, that my specialty for the last 15 or 20 years has been in the realm of addiction research in psychology.
Yeah.
Most of it looks at the individual, doesn't look at them in the context of their family, much less the context of their culture or of the world. And you and I both know that the context of the world, for example, right now, in terms of what's going on internationally, politically, economically, socially, has a huge impact on the individual. But the psychology that I was exposed to, except for Paul Hebert and one other professor, Chuck Kraft, was radically individualistic. So it missed the context, what this author calls the high context. The other piece that I'm very struck by is that he introduced us to the idea of the researcher in anthropology was what he called a participant observer, that you have to participate in the community to understand it, which means you can't just observe it from the outside because you miss too much important information. And that stayed with me because I have to tell you, Tomas, is that all the way through graduate school, and then I ended up teaching in graduate school for 15 years, teaching doctoral students in psychology, which I had once been. We were teaching clinical psychologists to work with people, and almost the entire approach was looking at people from the outside. So we learned about how to diagnose disorders. We learned about treatment programs that you could empirically study, like you could give numbers and you could give quantitative research. And there's value to that, just as this article just talked about that we shared. The problem is there wasn't enough attention given, almost no attention given to looking at people from the inside, from their own experience as well as the experience of the community. And that's what Paul Hebert taught me, is that when you go to study in India, I had another professor that spent his years studying in West Africa, is that you have to become part of the community to understand it. And that's not what I learned in psychology. So I feel like my psychological training was so skewed towards Western science, were it not for a couple of exceptions. And this material that you're reintroducing me to now, really harkens back to something that I felt really strongly. Now, I've spent my entire career as a clinical psychologist and now a recovery coach. When I was teaching in the university, I was the one faculty member that was teaching clinical psychology who was actively seeing clients clinically. Virtually all of my peers on the faculty were researchers. They were researching psychology, they were researching psychopathology, they were researching interventions, but they weren't clinicians. And that was the same for me in graduate school. I remember finishing graduate school and thinking, did I have one faculty member that I would want to see in psychotherapy? The answer was zero.
Yeah.
It's really very, very sad
So,
commentary on Western science, it seems like to me.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Bob. When I was reflecting towards this session about the issue we are covering, there are quite lots of issues we have, and we might have to pick out some essentials, only. And what I think is interesting is to have these two expressions. On one hand, we have ecosystems, and on the other hand, we have biocommunity. Yeah, and these are two expressions right from the heart
Yeah.
of like the Western, but also the indigenous uh, system, And I think what is very interesting when we start to see why they are so different. On one hand, I always when I was in my studies and everything, I thought ecology is something very, very good, very, I mean, very holistic somehow. And now, uh, I mean, it in generally it is because if you look at a certain ecosystem of this valley or whatever, there are some points of view to how to describe and how to you know uh, on the other hand, I think what the indigenous expression of the bio community says is there is a community. I mean, that's what you have been bringing up now. There's a community between different members, and as the indigenous people say, between humans and other
Yeah.
than humans,
Yes.
they say.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So that means on one hand, it's a deep interrelationship in between people living together in the indigenous view and in the really that's what this book is pointing out. It's saying this is now some tens or hundreds of thousand years back
Yeah.
where hunters and gatherers were living in these small groups and where they had on one hand interrelated in this group, but not as separated as we are, because there was it was quite a kind of a big family.
Yeah.
And they took care of the children. Many of these adults did, and of course the elders too. And so it's interesting then. And then the other thing is what seems to be, and it's in these chapters saying that there has been a point where Western science just kind of cut off or lifted off from Earth. So
Mm.
it disconnected from Earth because we are different. We are supposed to be something more, something. And out of this came all the philosophy and even especially also the religious philosophies. I think that's very interesting. They're saying the Abrahamic religions, they they brought up this issue very much as the scientists in the Western world too. So this lift off and this disconnect is one of the major issues between bio community being living and being and between towards like ecosystem understanding we have today. I think that's something what I yeah what that struck me quite a lot
Yeah. Yeah.
when I was thinking about it,
Mm.
and yeah, that's why I wanted to bring it up here.
Yeah, I'm glad that you did. I still remember my very first course in college, right out of high school, was a course in ecology. I was in high school when they had the very first Earth Day. It was 1970. I was taking biology, and I remember it being such a big deal. And it was a start. I mean, I think you're acknowledging it. It was a start. And I was really grateful for that course. So my first science course in college was ecology, and it was taught by a wonderful professor who was very impassioned and cared deeply. But as I was listening to you, what I was aware of was the limitation. You and I have talked about the work of Ken Wilber and his integral model. It's a four-quadrant model. And what I was thinking of is the two lower quadrants. The right-hand quadrant is looking at systems from the outside, and that's more how we studied ecology. It was looking at systemic interactions, but all from the outside. And when you talk about a relationship between humans and other than humans, it feels like to me we're moving into the left-hand relational aspect of the collective, of the more than two. And Ken Wilber's model provides for that. There's value of looking at things systemically, but it's not looking at things from the perspective of biocommunity. That's a very different perspective. And now I did not get that in my ecology class, with no disrespect to the teacher. At least he was opening my eyes up to something. Um, I didn't get that. We studied systems theory in graduate school, but it was looking at systems from the outside. There wasn't the sense of engagement. I have to tell you one other thing, Tomas, is this last Friday I was sitting with an 85-year-old female client, and we spent the entire session talking about her history with dogs, pets in her lives.
All
She
right.
actually had a dog there, and we moved into a conversation. We were on Zoom like you and I are, but all of a sudden, her dog, whose name is Jacques, was a part of the conversation. And we talked about every dog. This is an 85-year-old woman who's had lengthy relationships with furry friends across a lifetime. And what I want to mention is that she's not the exception. I've had any number of clients. I can think of one client, a young man, for several years, the thing that we worked on in our therapy together was the loss of his prized dog, the loss of Liam. I remember Liam's name.
I see.
Is that there was no training in graduate school to look at the idea of biocommunity. We could look at systems, but we wouldn't talk about Liam or Jacques as being an individual of value and with a personality and a contribution. It makes me think back to Descartes, when I don't want to blame him for this, but the idea of I think, therefore I am, which is kind of the bedrock of enlightenment and of modern science. And you can see how that's gone in science. It makes me think when I sit with a client like my client on Friday, it might be better to say I relate or even I love, therefore I am. It's a very different approach to how do we form identity? Is it our thoughts? If it's just our thoughts, then we can do what you talked about, which is just move further and further away from the earth, just become more and more disembodied. Whereas if we stay connected in biocommunity, the way that you're speaking of it, it's a very different move, and it doesn't disconnect us. In fact, it's radical to think that Westerns, it's from a Western scientific perspective, it's almost like a big question mark. What are you even talking about? How would we study in connection? Because there are no models, or at least historically, there have not been strong models. This book, your book, open up a conversation of what can we do to include a model that extends from birth all the way across the lifespan with human beings, and then includes other than humans, including places, animals, plants like the tree, all of that. Your book, I mean, your book is a testimony to this. This tree is not just a pretty image. It's a tree with personality and history. And it's you start your book right with that, with biocommunity. So anyway, I just really I love what you're talking about, making that contrast.
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of issues that have been brought up, and one that that was very impressive to me is uh, what is described by the by creating a nest to grow up little children. This is uh, from from Darcia Narvaetz. I think
Yes,
this
yes,
is
yeah.
one of her
Mhm.
great issues she's
Mhm.
talking about, and and on one hand, I think it is really striking, and it's really uh, it's so um, yeah, it's no, she's talking about why this kind of um, growing up as a child within a community, within a like a like a clan, you say, where all these different people have their role, and the children's play from almost the beginning. They play with one another, and all the grown-ups looking after them. So mother is engaged like about when the child is like 4 or 5 years is engaged like 40%, and then there's the father, there's the grandmother, there's and there are so many characteristics she's describing there, how these children are nourished and are taken care. Um, I mean, when I was reading this, I almost came into tears, because that was something I somehow I miss from like until today. Even though I think yes, I grew up on a place where more things have been there, and there has been certain communities, but not in the first years. And I think what she's then bringing up is importantly is that she's saying in her she's doing scientific work um, on this, looking at Westerners, saying if people miss this or didn't get it, they they um they are prone to to several kinds of psychic or social um, problems. They like getting sick in different kinds of ways. And I think that's something that was really striking me when I was reading it, and I think that's something she's saying we have to bring it back into our society
Yes,
in
yes.
ways there. And that was something that hit me like personally uh, a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I feel similarly when I read her. I was reading that same section that you're describing. I was very touched by the connection of family. I was even touched by the idea of play, how it is that there. I only know of one psychologist. He's from the Netherlands, a Dutch psychologist who wrote a book called Homo Ludens, which is Latin for man at play, is that what makes us human beings is when we play. And she writes about that, is that the children learn in the context of playing with one another and engaging with grandfathers and uncles and aunts and so on. And I can't speak for you, but I can speak for me. When I read that, I missed so much of that early on, and I miss so much of that nowadays. Is that we live in a society. I remember working with a minister in therapy some years ago, and he said that he'd been working as a minister, a Christian minister, for years. And in the old days, he would go knock on people's doors, and there was a sense of being invited in. And he was telling me, and this is some years ago, is that now everybody lives in gated communities and they've got secret codes to get into their property. He says it's almost impossible for him as a minister to visit congregations because they're not available. And that stays in my mind as a way that we've separated and disconnected, where even in a religious community, like a church, let's say, there's very little community compared to what maybe was the case a generation ago, not that long ago. Yeah.
Mm.
I did some reading since the last time that we talked as well in the realm of addiction. And you know, Tomas, that my work is with clients primarily that are addicted to substances like alcohol or other drugs, but it can include a whole range of behaviors that it's anything that we do to feel better in the short term that has long-term costs to us. And the research, at least in the United States, is that 90% of Americans acknowledge they have at least one behavioral addiction right now. About 20% of Americans are addicted to substance, but 90% say they have a behavioral addiction. What I was looking at was what does the research say that is the number one trigger for addictive behaviors? And there was a study done at Harvard University that compiled 200 different studies. They call it a meta-analysis. And the number one factor was stress. In fact, they looked at it in terms of rises in cortisol and adrenaline, the stress hormones. And so, but they didn't stop there. They went in, well, what is it that's the number one trigger for spikes in cortisol and adrenaline? And
Yeah.
they and what they found is what you're talking about. The term they used was threats to social connection, threats to social acceptance. And so, if we're not connected with one another, we're exposing ourselves day in, day out to what one client of mine, she was a registered nurse, she said, Bob, we're all barbecuing in our own adrenaline. That was the term she used, is that there's a way that we're being exposed to that, and it's seen as normal. And that's why addiction is so normal because all of us are so stressed out and it leads to depression and anxiety and addiction. I mean, I'm thinking from a psychological framework. You mentioned psychic and social conditions. It's horrific, the costs of what's going on right now. One other point, my wife and I were talking last night. We were talking about how it is that people are always on their phones and that Colleen is my wife, she's also a psychotherapist. She was commenting on how it wasn't so long ago that if you were waiting in line at a store or if you were waiting outside of a library for the doors to open, you would just sit quietly and look at nature or engage with somebody else. And nowadays, if you go to a grocery store, at least in the United States, everyone's looking at their phone. And
Yeah.
if people are waiting for anything, waiting for a movie to start, no one was just constantly engaged in some kind of activity. Colleen asked a good question. She said, "I wonder what possible advantages there might be to that." I appreciate her asking that. But the essence of our conversation was what are the costs of that? What are the costs of being so disconnected where I'm looking at my phone and you're looking at yours and we're standing right next to each other in the line at the grocery store and we don't communicate?
Yeah, or I mean, one thing is to communicate, and the other thing, when I have to for several months already, I have to go to physiotherapy because of my legs, and and then when I sit there in the waiting room, I just sit there, and when my therapist is coming out and bringing me in, she's saying, "You're the only one that just sit there." Instead of looking into these boxes or doing anything, just reading newspapers or
Yeah,
I think that this is
that says a
something.
lot.
Uh, of course, this is something. Uh, another point to focus on, that we cannot we are always distracted, and I think the interesting thing, when I was reading about bio community and how indigenous or original indigenous people, there might be lots of them you know, separated from their culture, or at least partially, or couldn't really go back to their roots, to their decolonized roots, and at least the ones they do. I feel remembered some times when I was in scouting here in Switzerland. We have been always, mostly we have been in the same forest, and there we have been, it's quite a huge forest, and we have been knowing it, by, you know, even in the night, we mostly knew where we are, and to be there and to listen to these noises, and to listen to have this smell of the wood, of the, of the grass, of the, of all these plants, and you have some noises. There's some animals moving around, and I think it's so beautiful to this is I think this is something that is covered also, I think, by forest bathing,
Yes,
and
yes,
and
yes.
was found out as something really healthy, just to be there, to listen, to smell, to uh, and there we have a way to reconnect, to reconnect to nature, and and I think in my new latest book, and also in this book we are talking about, it is it they're talking about Gaia, the Gaia
Yeah.
uh, consciousness. That means uh, there are several, even scientific issues saying the planet is a living organism, you know,
Yes.
and
Yes.
we, as we live on it, so we there are several kinds and sizes of organisms, and if we start to listen what our mother, our planet says, um, we probably just act completely spontaneous, totally different, and totally natural, and yeah, I think that there's so many things uh, written in there. So these are things that really move me.
Yeah. You remind me of something just now. Will you give me just a second? I have a book back over here that I want to pull off my bookshelf. When I was in graduate school all those years ago, and I was studying uh, very individualistic psychology, I remember thinking that all my courses are on psychopathology, on what goes wrong with human beings. And I thought to myself, I wonder if we had a library down in the basement of the graduate school. There's a library of psychology, and so one night I took it on myself. I want to see if I can find a book on human thriving, on health, on well-being. And I walked up and down the stacks, and I finally did find one book out of hundreds, maybe I don't know, thousands of books. I'm not sure. And it was a book, and it was written. I was in graduate school in the 1980s. This book had been written 30 years before then, in the 1950s. That was the one book that I could find. What I pulled off my shelf was a book that was written when I was in graduate school by two people that had been influential for me. The book is called Beyond Health and Normality, and the authors of the book are Roger Walsh and Dean Shapiro. Roger Walsh is a friend of mine. Um, in fact, Roger Walsh is the closest friend of Ken Wilber, and so there's a wonderful connection with Ken through Roger. Roger co-authored this book, and Dean Shapiro I live in Southern California. Dean Shapiro doesn't live very far from me. Dean Shapiro was helpful to me. My doctoral dissertation was on mindfulness meditation, and Dean Shapiro was an expert. He'd written books in this area. So they came together and they wrote this book, Beyond Health and Normality. What they did is they took it beyond just looking at well-being. They said, what about thriving? What about really exceptional possibilities for human beings? That image came up to me as I listened to you as a scout, as a boy out in the woods, out in the forest, smelling and the richness of that, and how it is that, at least in my experience, we've come to settle on such a low bar, such a low expectation. What does this author call it? Low context, like a 1-inch view of human happiness. It's so pathetic in terms of it's being so paltry, so limited. And you're talking about smelling grass and wood and the sounds and the dark and being able to find your way through the forest. All of that begins to open up into what feels like richness, a robust life. Why would we settle for any less than that, Tomas? Why would we settle for? Why would we settle for this? Like you. By the way, I go to physical therapy too for my lower back, and I'm also the only person there that I know that does what you do. You and I are brothers. We'd be sitting there together.
Yeah.
We'd probably be either sitting in silence together, side by side, or maybe speaking. But I'm surrounded by people. Everybody is on their phone, and the woman behind the desk where I am, she's always on her computer, and I suppose that's her job. But there's no interaction with anybody until they come out to get me, and then I interact with
Yeah.
the physical therapist. I find it ironic. But why would we settle for this when we could be sitting at peace in a waiting room or connecting with a friend in a waiting room? And we do it all the time and it's considered normal.
Yes, I think that's what what comes up when we read this book now, and uh, we can see and we can experience in our normal lives, and how far away we disconnected from by a community, and by a community means it's you're if you are on one place, you know that you're connected to everything else,
Yeah,
at the same time.
yeah,
And if I think if indigenous people rise up like this, and for me, it's definitely one of the very strong goals of elderhood, that
mm,
we return back to these qualities, and to because our bodies, our body houses, as I say,
mm,
allow us less and less and less. So it's an invitation to
yes,
to just stay and sit, And even though you don't hear everything anymore, you only hear one bird instead of two, It's still there, And
yes,
and and I think if elderhood work is done properly, there is all the nonverbal communication, all the
yeah,
energetic comings and goings, and I think that's what is so important. I think for us as elders, I mean, the indigenous point of view is one point that um, we should pick up again,
yeah,
to 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 come back uh, as elders to a certain kind of, I call it relative wisdom,
mm,
to look at this tree, like 700 years tree, and you
mm,
just stay there, and you go like you know you just stay there being awed
mm,
by the aura of this tree, and
mm,
what I do in these days, when I look at trees like this, or any other I go there and talk to the tree, you know.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
And
I
so
do too. I do too. I do too. I
so I
highly recommend it.
that's
Yes.
how I start.
Yeah.
Or we should start to get reconnected, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Tomas. Thank you for all of this. I really appreciate you laying out this topic for today. It's a really important topic for all of us. And I think particularly for you and me, talking about spiritual elderhood, is that we as elders want to lead the way in reclaiming our connection to the bio community. I think it's brilliant what you've suggested. I recommend every single person that views this to get your book. And if they read it in German, wonderful. And if they read it like I do with some limitations, there's still so much to get out of the book. And plus, it does motivate me, as I told you earlier. We will work on this in the next year to get this translated from German into English. And then we'll work on Swahili and Sanskrit.
Yeah, no, I think at least you have the original book of Shachter-Shalomi Miller.
Yes, I do.
We don't have in German, so it's a very powerful book, and you
Yes.
have this book like Indigenous Sustainable Wisdom. And one of the big motivations to write my book in German is saying, how can it be that in the whole in the entire German, you know, space, I can hardly find any text at all talking about what could be elderhood as a path, as a very rich and
Yeah.
incredibly important part for our society. And that's why I said, all right, I have to write this book, and then I will some ideas I will just bring. I will translate in from English to German, and I always write in my German book. I will translate it similarly to its origin. I
Yes.
I never say it's exactly the meaning because
Yeah.
and then I put a note so everybody that wants to read it in its origin,
Yeah.
there is the source brought into the book so they can read it in
Yeah. Yeah, that's well done. It's really good. Tomas, I have to get going in just a second, so
yeah.
say goodbye for right now. We have scratched the surface. I wouldn't mind coming full circle to this topic or related topics in our next podcast. This is so rich to me, what we've opened into. Thank you for this, Tomas. Thank you for this conversation. Really, really valuable to me.
Yeah, I think it's so precious because I almost have no other people to communicate on this issue because most people they are not as how you say a little bit approached or a little bit how you say elders in you know in certain training done already. So so we can talk because we understand each other very well
Yeah, we
instead
do.
of having to explain everything from A to Z. It's
Yeah,
so it's that's why it's so precious to me to have this communication with you, Bob.
yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Tomas. Thank you for this. Thank you for this time. We will continue, but I hope that everyone enjoys this conversation with Tomas and myself, and we'll be back for more, okay? Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for today, Tomas. I look forward to the YouTube video. I do share them. I shared our most recent one with one of my colleagues at work. She's a woman about my age, and she said it's wonderful. So I do pass the
Oh,
word around.
oh,
Yeah.
great.
And your book. And your book. Okay. All right, my friend. I got to scoot. I have a client
Yeah.
waiting for me. Much love to you, Tomas. I wish you well. Thank you again for today. Really rich, really meaningful.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you, and all the best
Yeah,
over the
thank you.
pond. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Thank you. Bye bye for now.
Goodbye.